Thank you so much for having us here, and thank you very much for having me here. I will be talking about what happened to me shortly, and it's just a real honour for me. And thank you so much for joining as well, Elizabeth and Chiara. So we'll get straight into the questions then. I'll position myself here. So Elizabeth, I'm going to ask you first, because we just heard there that the former Secretary General Kofi Annan once referred to the UN as indispensable institution. So could you tell us what the world has accomplished because of the power and the credibility that the UN has?
Well, thanks very much, Charlie, and good afternoon to you all. It's really a pleasure to be here. Well, there's a lot to choose from, actually, to answer that question, and let me just give you 4 examples. First, some of you will know, many of you will know, that after the end of the Cold War in 1989, the world was rife with civil wars. Levels of violence were extraordinarily high, and suffering was very high. UN peace efforts had an enormous amount to do with bringing most of the wars of the 1990s to an end and to seeing them stay ended. As a result, levels of political violence around the world dropped to an all-time low at the time, and the UN had an enormous amount to do with that. Second example, the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. Both of them were agreed at the end of 2015. And together, those agreements lay out a framework for ambitious action to combat poverty, to create more just and inclusive societies, and to really steward the natural resources of our planet for future generations. Those were truly universal agreements. And where else would you have done them than at the United Nations? Third example, the Millennium Development Goals, the ones that preceded the Sustainable Development Goals. Again, where else would you have secured agreement on ambitious goals like those than at the United Nations? And they had a huge impact in improving health outcomes throughout the world, in having under 5 mortality, dramatic gains in the fight against HIV and AIDS, significant gains in primary school education for both boys and girls. And the MDGs had everything to do with that, and the UN had so much to do with the MDGs. And the last example I'd give you, which might be a surprising one, but in the first 45 years of the UN's history, it exerted an enormous calming influence on probably one of the most destabilizing issues at the time, which was the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. And simply by having to sit in a Security Council together, by having a common responsibility for international peace and security, even if at times in other places they were actually at war with each other, that dynamic had a huge calming influence on one of the most greatest risks, actually, to the world community at the time. So there'd be 4 examples for you.
Well, yeah, I mean, it just
they're
shows...
all relevant today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's completely indispensable. Then, Chiara, would you like to chip in and maybe talk about it from your point of view?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be amongst all of you. So the UN also has, in addition to what was just said, the UN also has a very important role to play in the humanitarian field. I have been working for the UN Refugee Agency for over 15 years in different field locations. And it's very palatable to see what the UN can do and can achieve when it's present in the field. At the moment, the UN Refugee Agency, for example, serves in over 129 locations with over 10,000 staff and serves over 65 million people around the world. A lot of the work we do is life-saving. Every year the UN is able to feed over 100 million people that are living in very difficult circumstances. In other circumstances, we play an important coordinating protection role. For example, when I was serving in Sudan, in Darfur, where in 2013, where there was massive levels of displacement, we had over 900,000 displaced people at any given time. We were working very closely with the peacekeepers, for example, whose responsibility was there to make sure that where there was significant displacement, they would be able to protect areas where people had been displaced. And that meant literally protecting the lives of children and women who had to flee situations of violence. In other circumstances, UNHCR and other UN agencies play a very important role when it comes to solutions. For example, in the good years where wars were not so at the front and we were actually able to look at solutions for refugees, we were coordinating the return of over 3 million people back to Afghanistan. And that return would have never happened without the ability of the UN to be on the ground and support people that were there. In another experience where I believe that we have made a very significant difference was, for example, during the civil war in Ivory Coast, where you had people that were literally in between the zones of conflict, and we were able to literally evacuate everybody from very, very dangerous areas. And that meant literally taking women and children and men onto buses and negotiating safe passages and moving people from one place to another where they could be safe. And that is only able because we were able to only do that because they were perceiving the UN as being a neutral and impartial entity able to sort of go within the line of conflict and negotiate access and negotiate support for populations. So I believe that was, that is the role that the UN can play in a humanitarian context, which is extremely important and life-saving.
Yeah, absolutely essential. So what reforms are being proposed at the moment then to make sure it's almost even better, especially with the way that our current global environment is? Elizabeth?
Yeah, I think there are a few things. I think first, the UN wasn't created to be an expeditionary organization, but in the last 20 years, that's what it's become. It's worked in the kind of conflict zones that Chiara just was describing. It does peace operations. And so one big part of the reform agenda at the UN is making sure that it really can be a field-based organization that supports its people and supports the people they're there to serve in so many different zones of risk around the world. A couple of recent innovations that I think we're all take great confidence in. One was how open the selection process was for the new Secretary General. There's a new Secretary General. He started in January. Historically, the Secretary General of the UN was always chosen in very closed doors, kind of the way the Pope is chosen. The smoke comes out and you find out who is leading the organization at the end of the day. This one involved hearings. It involved civil society debates. There probably still was a bit of closed door discussion, but it was a much more open process. And as a result, I think people feel a greater stake in the organization. And one of the things he came into office saying is that he's absolutely committed to gender parity in the organization. Massively overdue, but they're on a timeline to produce it, and I think with great seriousness.
Okay, and Chiara, would you like to answer the same question, or I have got
sure.
another one
this
for you?
This is actually something quite close to my heart. The new Secretary General was our previous High Commissioner, and he spent over 10 years reforming the organization. So we went through a very, very painful process of reform, and nobody likes change, and obviously neither did we. And he actually set the organization very much, on the forefront of reform, making sure that we were very much field-based, decentralized, focused on persons of concern, making sure that we were very close to beneficiaries. That was very much at the heart of his agenda, and I know that he's bringing it with him into his new role. One of the very important things that I think he's also will be bringing to the United Nations is the notion that we are living in a world that is completely overridden by conflict, and that we need new ways, new diplomatic ways to address it. And he's very much talking about ways in which to bring creative thinking into diplomacy, and really trying to bring back a sort of a level of normalcy to this world that has really gone a bit too far when it comes to conflict.
So on what you've just said, it's kind of a similar question, but I'm interested in what at the moment in the UN's mission is making you hopeful for the future.
I think there are a number of things to look at. I mean, first I would say is the new UN leadership. We're, in addition to the Secretary General, he has brought in and elevated people from within the system who are absolutely committed to delivery, results, and to that very, as Chiara explained, that beneficiary-oriented approach to the UN's life-saving work. I think, the other thing that gives me broadly speaking, hope is just the recognition that one sees in so many quarters of the world about how much we really need cooperation to solve our problems. I think although sometimes our politics may divide us in particular ways, underneath that, and I think for most people, there's a recognition that we have so much more in common than we have that divides us, and a pretty deep mutuality of interest, and that's really what the UN is all about. And I think we have a leadership at the UN that is able to make good on that promise.
Yeah, I think cooperation, definitely a key word. Chiara?
Just perhaps to add, having come for many, many, many years serving in the field, I can say that we have thousands and thousands of staff today working in the most horrible of conditions, in the most dangerous of places, to fulfill the values, the views of the organization, to really try and move forward the values that it stands for. And I think that that's something to be very hopeful about, the fact that we still continue to be able to recruit talent and people that are willing to put themselves in harm's way to help others. I think that's really important.
Very inspiring. Elizabeth, you've sat on the front line as well of those interactions between the US and the UN. You just mentioned politics yourself, in particular around the creation of, I'll get it right, global goals for sustainable development. So what major changes have you seen since that policy?
Well, I think a couple of things. I think first, we have seen already since the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed at the end of 2015, we've seen a remarkable uptake of that framework by a lot of different constituencies. We've seen companies try to integrate that framework into their own strategies for producing long-term value. We've seen cities like New York or states like Hawaii look at that framework of goals to think about their own sustainability objectives and actually bring them into their planning and their strategies for public investment. We've seen countries who are, particularly those who were at the forefront of negotiating them to begin with, countries like Colombia, like Kenya, like Sweden, and others, really take seriously this charge of doing business unusual, that we're not just going to operate in our respective silos, but we're going to look at problems together in a holistic way, developing new policy approaches and so on. So there's a lot of uptake in a way that's very exciting. But I would almost step back from the question and say that it's almost less about what we're seeing after the goals were agreed than what the underpinnings were of getting them agreed to begin with. Because I think so I was the lead U.S. negotiator during the process we were negotiating the goals. I would never have expected we would have reached as ambitious an agenda as that. Probably because I was kind of a jaded negotiator, that might have been the reason. But what I think unfolded over the couple of years where people were really wrestling with these issues was that they began to recognize the deeper currents of change in our world, the different opportunities we have to do things like eradicate diseases that we never would have dreamed possible before, but also some of the common threats. And I think on some level, maybe there was a little bit of funny oxygen in the room that we got during those couple of years. People lifted their game and they really strove for something that was quite transformative.
That's extremely interesting. It's good to know from your point of view, kind of see it from a different way rather than my question. It's interesting.
In other words, I didn't answer your question.
Yeah, no, but it was really interesting for somebody like yourself as well to say that you were pretty jaded as a negotiator, and it's interesting that it actually surprised you and showed that we can actually, like you said, eradicate diseases.
I mean, I think, politics can be a blood sport. I think we all know that. It can be in almost any domain. But I think what has always been inspiring to me about the UN context is that you see diplomats from every country around the world who are really there to serve their country's interests, but also to find common cause. And when you create a kind of dynamic where people are really striving to look for that and they find that they have more in common than what divides them, that can be incredibly powerful.
So Chiara, what are the biggest challenges at the moment that the UNHCR are facing? You kind of smiled there. There's a lot, I can imagine. And talking of the kind of refugee crisis as well, how can we really help that?
Well, there are a number of intertwined challenges. The first is the proliferation of conflicts. We've had 15 new conflicts over the past 5 years. If this continues at this rate, I'm not so sure that we're going to be able to cope. That's the first challenge. The second is the numbers. The numbers have been growing steadily. We are 65 million, and we're just about to produce another statistical report that is just going to bring it up to another 5 million. So the numbers are enormous, and we have never seen this before, and it's really worrisome. The third is certainly the growing rhetoric, anti-refugee rhetoric. That it's becoming very powerful, and we have to figure out other ways to try and counteract it, and it's not necessarily easy. And the fourth is the issue of funding. 60 million people to support every day. It's a huge challenge, and we were already barely managing to meet half of our commitments, before. And the more the numbers are growing, and the less able we are to provide even the most minimal assistance to refugees and internally displaced people. So it's a mix of challenges, and we're not going to be able to stop this problem unless we figure out a way to address the conflicts. That's certainly the number one answer to how do we resolve the problem. So investing in what the Secretary General is planning on doing on diplomacy, on trying to address some of this conflict is certainly the priority. The second is this notion of stabilizing population to the extent possible, investing in countries that are neighboring to conflicts where people have settled, making sure that they have what they need and the countries are supported, so that you sort of continue to maintain the goodwill of the countries that are hosting large number of refugees, to continue to host them, but also to make sure that populations have hope and don't feel the need to actually start embarking on dangerous journeys. onward. And of course, the closer they are to home, the more likely it is that the refugees will go back home. So whenever the situation is resolved. So it is complex. It's not, there's no single answers. But we're certainly trying to do everything we can to assist those who need to be assisted in the meantime, but also looking forward and what are the solutions and what can we do to look for solutions for people that want to go back home or need support in the meantime.
I mean, it's incredibly inspiring to hear from both of you, but also, Chiara, just from what you said, quite worrying. But at the same time, like, we're all sat in this room, including myself. So I wonder, is there anything that we can do to help on our level? Is there anything we can do, Elizabeth?
I think there's a lot you can do every day. First, I mean, and you all do it because you're here to begin with. Pay attention, learn about what is happening in the world, talk to your friends about it, explain it to them so that they also, you expand the circle of awareness and understanding. Talk to your Congress people. That's an important thing to do about how important this work really is. But I think, as Chiara said, we are living at a time where it's possible to live in kind of bubbles of awareness about how other people live, and breaking down those barriers, really finding occasion for empathy and understanding about the circumstances in which so many people have to live extraordinarily difficult lives is probably the most important thing that you can do. But you're doing it because you're already here.
I think talking to other people is a very interesting point, because we all, obviously, we're in this room for a reason, because we're advocating it. But I believe that if you talk to another person, another person, another person, then it can actually start making a difference and changing opinion. Chiara?
No, I would agree. I think just remain open to the fact that there is an other out there that they may be joining your community. Talk to others about this problem. Talk to your congressman. Just be open to this type of issues, and and make sure that others know about them too.
I think that's it. Thank you so much for joining us.